Electronics Product Stewardship, all the way from WA, from the WA Local Government Association, or WALGA. Can I please get you to put your hands together for Rebecca Brown, everybody?
Fabulous. Thank you for that awesome introduction. I think, for our conference, we need to import you, really.
I'll go back to WA.
All right, well, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm going to talk about essentials of product stewardship today, and I'll touch on the electronic product stewardship as well. First and foremost, though, a massive thank you to Meredith and the team at Legant. Can we give Meredith a big round of applause, please? She's a bit chilly, so maybe we can embarrass her and warm her up. All right, so product stewardship. It's where producers take responsibility, financial or physical, for what they produce. The goal, where we want to get to, is no product is released onto the market without a clear and costed end of life pathway. At the moment, things are produced and just kind of chucked out there into the market, and no real thought goes into, well, how are we going to recover that? Can it even be recovered? So that's the dream. That's what we're building towards, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners as well. This is a picture from WA. All right, so product stewardship. There is a massive potential for product stewardship. It's great. It's the opportunity to put costs onto the people buying a product rather than in the community at large. It's a way potentially to embed the circular economy if we actually design a product stewardship scheme to facilitate that. We've got options in terms of logistics. I mean, a lot of the challenges that you guys face up here, and we certainly have in WA as well, is around logistics. Something got out there, how do we get it back? And in the most efficient, environmentally, socially, and economically viable way. So there's lots of opportunity. We can increase material recovery. When we know, okay, this many things were put onto the market, and we've got this many back, we actually know we're recovering material. It was fantastic to hear that the NT CDS is getting 80% recovery rate. That is incredible. In WA, we haven't had a container deposit scheme for as long as you guys. We're only around 67%, but we're tracking upwards. So when you have product stewardship scheme, you actually have people who are driven to recover materials. Without that, we don't know. Are we recovering everything? Probably not. So there is a lot of opportunity in product stewardship. However, local government's relationship over the years with product stewardship has been quite complicated for a number of reasons. Not all product stewardship schemes are created equal. And I'm going to just talk briefly about some of the different schemes that are out there. So I'll go through. So voluntary schemes. Voluntary national schemes, one example is Paintback, which has put a levy on every litre of paint sold to fund recycling of paint. In WA, we run a household hazardous waste programme. So that's why Alga runs it on behalf of the state government. It's a $1.5 million a year programme. Recycling household hazardous waste is really expensive, and we've got 15 sites across the state. The most recent one in Karratha, which is possibly not quite closer to here than to Perth, but it's a long way. So Paintback has reduced the cost of that programme by $600,000 a year, because it is a product stewardship scheme which is covering all of the costs of recycling, so the collection and the recycling of the product. So that's a voluntary national scheme. Then you have voluntary accredited, and the accreditation is under the Recycling and Waste Reduction Act, which is the national legislation. So an example of that, a couple of them, we talked about tyres yesterday. So TSA, I think, is an accredited scheme, and there is also one called Fluorocycle. So they are nationally accredited, but they're not actually saving money for local governments. They're tyre stewardship. They're looking at market development, options for the product, which is great, but they're not actually covering the cost of recycling. Fluorocycle is just a kind of an accreditation scheme. Organisations sign up and say, oh yeah, we'll recycle our fluoros. So by contrast, through our household hazardous waste programme again, fluorescent light globe recycling costs us $70,000 a year. So Fluorocycle is not covering any of those costs. It's just a kind of ineffective product stewardship scheme. Then we talk about co-regulatory schemes. So the National TV and Computer Product Stewardship Scheme, I spoke about that last year. We were very much expecting the scheme to have been reviewed and updated and implemented by now, but somewhere in the midst of a federal election and delays probably due to COVID, we still haven't got a new scheme. But the idea of the National TV and Computer Product Stewardship Scheme was that it would cover the whole cost of recycling and transport for TVs and computers, so for things in scope. That's not the case in WA. I'm not sure what the situation is up here, but in WA, to recycle TVs and computers, even if you're part of the scheme, is still costing $300 a tonne. And for non-scheme, so for all of the other things with the plugs that aren't TVs and computers, it's costing us $700 a tonne. And that's just the recycling cost. That's not the transport and logistics. So we've got, these national schemes that aren't necessarily delivering in all of the areas they need to. Then you've got things like co-regulatory state schemes, so for example, container deposit schemes. Then you've got co-regulatory all jurisdiction legislation schemes like the Australian Packaging Covenant. And I'm going to introduce a wonderful acronym, so the National Environmental Protection Measure for Used Packaging Materials, the NEPM-UPM, is the national regulation for the packaging covenant. So what that means is every state and territory has mirrored legislation. So you have a piece of legislation in each jurisdiction rather than nationally consistent legislation. And that means that if a state and territory is under-resourced, they can't enforce it. And I don't think anyone has ever been prosecuted under the NEPM-UPM. So also, the Packaging Covenant doesn't address the issues we have with packaging, which is it costs a lot of money to collect, process, and recycle it. And with the export bans, which we've been talking about, it's going to be really, really expensive to onshore everything. So the Packaging Covenant is another area where we really need to up the game. And then national mandatory schemes. So the used oil scheme is a national mandatory product stewardship scheme. Again, there's a levy on every litre of oil sold. And what that levy goes towards is an incentive for recyclers. So back in the day, probably 15 years ago, we didn't have oil-to-oil recycling plants, or not many of them. And the government said, well, we want oil to be turned back into oil. So recyclers, if you can build an oil-to-oil recycling plant, we'll give you 50 cents a litre for every litre of used oil that you put through it. So they incentivise the end product. And that's actually been fairly successful. Again, I'm sorry, I don't know in the NT, but in WA, we have an oil-to-oil recycling plant that we would not have had otherwise. Cost of oil recycling is still not free, but that could be fixed if they increase the levy and increase the incentive for recyclers. So that's just a broad overview of some of the types of schemes. So I hope you're all a little bit confused by that. Because you can see we kind of have this plethora of approaches, which is nice, but it doesn't mean we get consistency, and it doesn't necessarily mean that it's easy for people to engage with them. And, for local government, you are on the front line. That's the point. If the resident comes to the site and you say, I'm sorry, we can't take that, your front of house people, they're the ones who cop it. The companies, we've talked about responsibility, and I think it was really interesting, Deepika put up all of her, these are the stakeholders. It's like, yep, they've all got different roles, but lots of them don't have responsibility for actually dealing with the waste, whereas local government does. Service provider of last resort. So, we have a real interest in making sure product stewardship schemes actually work. All right, so that's kind of the landscape of product stewardship. So what are we going to do about it? Because ultimately we want to fix this. So WALGA worked with Legant and all of the other state and territory associations. We put together basically a list of these are the 10 things that we think product stewardship should meet. And if you meet these 10 things, then you'll have an effective product stewardship scheme. Rather than this kind of proliferation of different schemes that don't really have any standard approach. So we're going to use this for advocacy. Individual change is important. The groundswell of people who actually care about waste, influences political direction. We've got probably now more attention on waste politically than we've ever had. It's pretty significant. It's a good time. But we have to get effective with our advocacy. And we want to be consistent because, what works in New South Wales in terms of product stewardship doesn't necessarily work in NT or WA or bits of Queensland or Tasmania because they're more remote and the challenges are more acute. So, right, responsibility. Producers should be responsible for their products. That's, beginning and end. How that happens is a matter of the design of the scheme. But at the moment, we have a situation where largely manufacturers are not considering the end of life of their products. In some places they are. In the EU, there's a lot more consideration of that, but that's only because they have product stewardship in place. So this is a recent example, because if you work for local government, you know you are the place everyone comes to ask questions. So how do you dispose of vapes, e-cigarettes? So we investigated this because we want to be able to provide advice to our local governments. So e-cigarettes include two things. They include a lithium battery, by and large, they're rechargeable, and that is a dangerous good under the regulations for transport, for handling, all of those things. They also include, depending on your state and territory, obviously, so in WA you're not supposed to have nicotine in them. I don't know what the situation is here, but there's the kind of the vape juice that people put in. So you can imagine you've got something with a lithium battery and then you've got something with a poison in it. And we only found one supplier who were actually able to recycle those products. We were very fortunate. They're on our preferred supplier list. We were like, cool, we can direct people to you, but that's the kind of complexity in that product. And then we have other organisations giving the community advice. You should put your e-cigarette in your waste bin. It's like you're advising them to put a lithium battery in their waste bin. We all know what happens when you compact lithium batteries in the back of waste trucks. They catch on fire. So, that's just one example. And, everyone would, if you start dismantling anything, you'll see there's such complexity in the products. Another good one is a container deposit scheme in WA. Tetra Paks are covered, some Tetra Paks, they're little tiny juice cartons and things like that. So it turns out the only place you can actually recycle Tetra Paks back into, products, and a facility that's designed for Tetra Pak recycling is Spain. There is a Tetra Pak recycling facility in Spain, and that is where the Tetra Paks from WA CDS are going. That's really, really expensive. And if you actually have to pay that cost as Tetra Pak, well, oddly enough, they start going, oh, well, actually, we should set up a facility in Australasia somewhere, New Zealand or Australia, so we don't have to pay the cost of sending Tetra Paks to Spain. I'm sure they enjoy the ride, but, it's not really the most efficient approach. So once you begin to have that shift in responsibility, then, there's actually incentive for change. Covering all costs, that's a really important one. If it's just covering a slice of the cost, it's like, well, that's still not full producer responsibility. That's still just like, helping out a little bit. And TV and computer scheme. Local governments have to offer the service free to residents and small business. That's the deal, but it's costing them money. So it's costing ratepayers because they have to then fund the $300 a tonne or the $700 a tonne for material that's not covered by the container deposit scheme. So that's why, as a matter of priority, the new federal government has to fix the TV and computer scheme so it covers all material, even more importantly, it's expanded to cover all electronic waste, and it is equitable. Because at the moment, there are national targets for the TV and computer scheme, but that doesn't mean that they're applied equally everywhere. And I know the numbers from WA, so WA is roughly 10% of the population of Australia, but the e-waste from WA only makes up 5% of what's being collected. And I think the numbers for NT are even smaller. So, with these schemes, it tends to be the focus on places where it's easy, convenient, and cheaper, rather than giving national coverage. But I will get to that later as well. Right, access. Leverage existing collection sites. Every scheme seems to think that it's new and unique and special, and therefore they have to set up a collection network. When Victoria and Tassie come online, we will have a national network of container deposit drop-offs. They are a great opportunity to be leveraged by other schemes so that they can collect materials, and it makes it a lot easier for the CDS points because they've got another source of income as well. So leverage existing collection systems. Unfortunately, when some people in the packaging industry want to leverage existing collection systems, what they want to do is they want to put everything humanly possible in curbside. And that's not the best way to recover a lot of things, because curbside recycling is really good for recovering, sort of bottles and cans and paper. Glass isn't ideal, but that's okay. But we don't want to be recovering soft plastics, and we don't want to be recovering batteries. Someone did suggest, as part of the consultation on the National TV and Computer Scheme, you could give everyone a little bag and then they could put their batteries in the curbside bin. You'll hear later why that's not what we're doing. But, leveraging existing collection locations for things that can't go in curbside and can't go in vergeside. And there are options, and it doesn't have to be local government. We are super excited about the battery product stewardship scheme. more later, because it's an opportunity for local government maybe to step back from providing collection locations because we don't need to, because there are heaps provided elsewhere. All right, easy and convenient and consistent for the community. When you work in government kind of circles, sometimes you forget that you actually have a customer out there, which is someone who knows nothing about waste and just wants to be able to dispose of whatever it is in the most straightforward way. We are trying to bring that back into the forefront and say, how do we make it easy and convenient for the community? Because if we make it easy and convenient and consistent, then they'll use it. If we don't, if we say, oh, well, you have to take your Nespresso coffee pods back to the florist, or, you know, that's actually where they collect them, you know, or you have to take it to 8 different locations, people aren't going to do it. Only the most dedicated. We want everything to be easily accessible by everybody, and not to be everything has to have a new brand, everything has to be labelled. We just want it to be easy. So, national coverage. Yes. So this is one very dear to our hearts in WA and obviously NT as well. Bits of Queensland, Tasmania, everywhere that isn't New South Wales or Victoria or the ACT. We want to make sure we get national coverage. As I said, with the TV and computer scheme, there are national targets, but they're not applied equitably. If you actually did apply equitably, then we might be in a better situation than we currently are with the scheme. So with the how access is determined as well, there isn't a consistent approach between product stewardship schemes. So in WA, our container deposit scheme determined one approach, the TV and computer scheme has another metric around access, and every scheme seems to come up with a different way of looking at things. So there's some rationale to that. Different products require different frequency of drop-off, but really, let's just be consistent. Everybody should be able to dispose of the things they've purchased in a reasonably convenient way. All right, scheme design, evidence-based. So looking at the actual costs, what does it actually cost? What are the risks? Who bears the risks? If the packaging industry want us to collect flexible plastics, as has been suggested through the curbside system in these little bags, I don't know if you've heard about the Kirby trial that they did in I think it was Victoria. So put your flexible plastics into a little bag and then put it in your curbside bin. Our messaging is, do not put anything bagged in curbside. We do not want things in bags because we do not know what's in them. So in that situation, the packaging industry, which is not running material recovery facilities, is not bearing any cost, is suggesting that they can influence our system. So in that case, look at who bears the cost, who bears the risk. It's going to be the material recovery facility operators, it's going to be the collection trucks, anyone where there's a chance that you're going to end up with things that you don't want in curbside. So really taking that evidence-based approach and ensuring that consumers are incentivized to be involved. And that could be a container deposit scheme type approach where it's a financial incentive, or just making it easy and convenient, because then to do the right thing is easier than not. National legislation, okay, so ideally, we are just having national approaches to products. Most products are sold on a national stage. Sometimes national doesn't work, but we have the legislation there, we need to use it. The Packaging Covenant, having all of these different jurisdictions trying to regulate it, it's just not practical. And that national approach needs to be funded. If you don't have compliance or an enforcement of the law, well, you're just basically requiring people to use their best endeavours to comply. And you need to check. You need to have checks and balances. So that's why we're pushing very much a national approach and consistency. Timely action. So the Paint Product Stewardship Scheme got up and running. It's a voluntary scheme in a relatively short time period. The National Container Deposit Scheme, which was a work in progress for a number of years and was very, at the time, effectively blocked by the packaging industry. So instead of taking a national approach to the container deposit scheme, which could have happened. We could have had a container deposit scheme probably 10 years ago that was national and was consistent. New South Wales led the charge and set up their own scheme, and every state and territory has followed and set up a scheme which is slightly different. I suspect if the packaging industry had realised that that was going to happen, they maybe would have just let a national scheme go ahead. And I think we've learned a lot through everyone doing their own scheme, but it's really not the most effective way of regulating. So having a nationally consistent approach is important, but also timely action and industry cooperation. So with those two things, you achieve the best outcomes. Who here closes their gates when their budget runs out for a year? So you've got, all right, I've got a budget for this much on scrap steel. It's going to cost me more. All right, okay, we're going to tell the community, in December, I'm sorry, you can't bring any scrap metal to the tip until, next financial year because, we can't afford it. I think you wouldn't be very popular. But a lot of these schemes, that's their approach. So, for example, the TV and computer scheme, the arrangements that deliver that, they reach their targets and then they stop collecting. And they've walked away from contracts in WA with councils and just gone, no. So we need to have something which is demand-based and not limited. Targets are sometimes useful for some materials. So in WA, our container deposit scheme within the next 2 years has to get 85% recovery. That is driving our scheme coordinator like nothing else to actually find out, well, where are the containers going? How can we recover them? What's the best way to do it? They spent $1 million on an advertising campaign to really emphasise to the community that they needed to recover the containers. No one has ever spent that much money on a waste campaign in that period of time, ever. But in that case, the target is actually driving change. For the TV and computer scheme, it's not. So understanding that, things are demand-based. I think we've probably covered some of this yesterday as well when we were talking about tyres, but people don't want to pay for things at end of life. When you've had your use out of the thing, you just want to dispose of it for free, and that's most likely to actually generate people's correct behaviour. So just embed the cost to recover that product in the purchase price, and particularly for things like tyres. Even if you buy the cheap ones, they're still not that cheap. So, that bit of extra will just cover the cost to recover them. And for remote areas, yes, it costs more, but there aren't that, there are still quite a lot of tyres out there, but it's not the same. Most of the costs will be covered by the larger states and territories where they've actually got more population and more people buying tyres. So those are our principles, and this is what we will be advocating to government. I'm really optimistic that we've got a chance to make a difference and to get some of these things shifted. Export bans are driving the packaging covenant as well, because we have to, stop exporting some of this material. We have to onshore the product, the recycling. And environment ministers have said all packaging has to be recyclable, reusable or compostable by 2025. So there are a lot of things bringing together the possibility that we actually might, maybe not by next year, but maybe the year after, I'll be standing here and going, yeah, product stewardship's going really well. This is fixed, that's fixed, but this could be improved. But we've really got that opportunity. And product stewardship is wonderful. We've also got things like bans coming in on various like single-use plastic. So all of these things working together, they can really shift it. That idea of breaking the loop, which is in the presentation earlier, that's possible if we get these things right. And my final comment as well is local government is at the forefront of this. Local governments have got some of the most progressive policies and initiatives around plastic, advocacy. One of our councils wanted to ban single-use plastic bags before the state government did, well and truly before. And essentially that local government said, well, we're putting a local law, we'll ban them. That and advocacy from ourselves and other local governments nudged the state government enough that they actually came out and said, all right, we'll ban them. So local government kind of has this opportunity to show up the government and make it a safe space for them to take action, whether it's territory, state or federal, because, it's okay if the closest tier of government to the community is making change because the community wants it. State, territory, federal government, you need to wake up and actually, engage as well, because if you don't, you're going to be bypassed because everyone's going to do it anyway. So I think local government has real strength and real power, and our opportunity is to act together nationally and at a state and territory level to really make sure that we can get these changes needed and that we're not having these discussions over and over. We're actually fixing the problem at the root, which is producers need to be thinking about end of life. They need to fully cost the recovery, and if we can do that, then we will actually progress towards a circular economy rather than this kind of limping slightly towards one. So thank you very much, everybody, and yeah.